Hello, I'm Leonardo Gonzalez. This is the first episode in my new podcast where I'm going to be sharing with you the latest in artificial intelligence. I'm part of the Trilogy AI Center of Excellence, and we focus on research, development, prototypes, and industry use cases for innovations in AI, and especially how they apply toward business applications and how they are relevant for people in industry to understand how to make use of the latest developments in AI. I do a weekly technical blog article examining one of several issues, and so I'll generally be sharing an episode where I discuss the latest article, and I will also be sharing latest developments in the industry, technical white papers and academic articles, things related to large language models and automation and research agents, agentic software development, multimodal AI, industry use cases in business, as well as academic papers. Since this is my first episode, it's going to be a little bit shorter, and I'm going to incorporate both the article and latest news events that happened this last week, which was actually a pretty full week. The article that I wrote was on Grok 4 and Kimi K2, two very large and important models that came out. It's called Clash of the Titans, since they are both extremely large models. Grok 4 was released with a lot of fanfare. It is described as the most intelligent model that exists today. It was posed as smarter than PhD with regard to academic tests in all fields. The concept of the breadth as well as the depth of knowledge and reasoning capability as far as the exam was highlighted. This brings to question a debate regarding benchmarks themselves. Benchmarks can be gamed, they can be manipulated, or basically these models can be trained and tuned to perform well on these benchmarks, which obviously has issues. One is that on the one hand, benchmark scores may not translate to real world utility. And on the other, models are getting so good at these benchmarks that we're seeing scores in the high 90s and even 100% on some of these exams, which means we need to create harder tests so that we can actually continue to measure improvement. There's also kind of crowdsourced human preference-based ranking. This was popularized with LLM Arena. Those also have brought some scrutiny, as happened with Llama 4 release of gaming, or releasing a version of the model that is tuned to perform well there and not translating to actual real-world performance. Benchmark controversies aside, Grok 4 is a very powerful model. There's a Grok 4 Heavy variant that is a kind of a multi-agent version. It's multimodal, which is extremely important for certain kinds of use cases and workflow. And it's relatively good at code, but it's not specialized in code. XAI is planning on releasing a code-specific model in the near future. Not sure exactly how far in the future that is. It could be a month or so. But a lot of people have been doing interesting software development with Grok right in the browser, just using a web app, having pretty good success for simple games, simulation. I've done some experiment using agentic software development tools, including one I've been working on called CLI Engineer, and it was able to do some complex process for sound visualization. I'm calling it feel. In the future, I would like to have sound-based emotion detection. It's obviously a much more complex problem to approach, and the models that I saw were not good. But as far as just starting with visualizing sound, this is something that's been done for decades, starting with an oscilloscope, Fourier transform, spectral, and had amazing success with it. It was not so good at creating visually appealing user interface. For that, I resorted to the standard Sonnet 4 inside agentic IDE like Windsurf. I had pretty good success. I also compared that to Kimi K2, which I'll talk about next, for research, for doing an investigation on information that's available on the web, synthesizing it and providing a report. Grok is pretty good at capturing real-time information, obviously on X, but in the web in general. It's good for intelligence gathering. They also have these scheduled tasks that you can have up to 50 ongoing tasks. They can be daily, weekly, monthly. You can look at latest developments, or you can do certain operations on a schedule. I've been looking at the daily AI news through that. Unfortunately, it's not so good at figuring out exactly what's novel or verifying what's true. There's a lot of duplicated. Every day I'm seeing Grok 4 mentioned or Kimi K2, even though it didn't come out that day. It's just that people are talking about it. But generally, it's a start. It's a start being able to incorporate intelligence gathering and alerts into your daily information gathering workflow. As far as the final report, I wasn't very happy with the structure, the narrative style, or the presentation of information. So I could see that as a weakness. There's two main criticisms, caveats to Grok. One was right on the heels of the release, the Mecha Hitler incident, which you may be aware of happened, became unhinged because of some change to the system prompt. It was doing very controversial, very inappropriate kinds of hate speech, essentially. That kind of was a big bummer for XAI as they were releasing this new model. XAI definitely differentiates itself by not having the same kind of guardrails as other models, which is a great way to have more freedom and less censorship in the applications, but it also has its risks, especially for user-facing app public sphere. The other main criticism for Grok 4 is the pricing, especially for the Grok 4 Heavy plan. It's at $3,000 a year or $300 a month, which puts it right up there with OpenAI Pro plan, Google Gemini Ultra plan, but it's even at a higher price point than that. We're starting to test the waters at higher and higher price points. I remember when $20 a month for ChatGPT Plus seemed something to be considered, and now we're looking at several hundreds of dollars as a new norm for professionals, since now AI is a necessary part of our tool set. Businesses and individuals are having to fork over more and more cash in order to leverage these tools. This limits access, especially when you look at the purchasing power internationally. It's just completely out of reach for many people in developing economies. It's a valid criticism and a valid concern, and something that's going to limit adoption. This is exactly in stark contrast to Kimi K2, which is a model that is receiving amazing community reception. It's an open source model, fairly open as far as its license and the way. Not exactly all of the training data and the training recipes. That's something that very few models are doing. There was a recent model, a small language model by a small AI that was 3 billion parameters. The Pareto frontier of efficiency and cost or speed relative to its performance. It's an open weight model, not exactly a fully open model, but it's open enough that inference providers can host it, people can run it themselves, and the academic community can learn from the model by working with it and by replicating some of the architecture and some of the optimization lessons. What's actually happening right now has been described as another DeepSeek moment. There's massive industry impact, both immediately and in the long term. And there's two important aspects to look at there. One is the capability, the power, the sheer power of the model. It's not a reasoning model per se because it doesn't have reasoning traces, but it has a very advanced ability to reason, to do mathematical problem solving. And especially where it shines is in agentic characteristics, its ability to use tools and to use tools appropriately. So this is especially evident and relevant when it comes to coding, also for solving math problems. And it has a very competitive performance on many other benchmarks. The widest gap between Grok 4 and K2 was in humanities last exam. One of the main highlights of Grok 4 is that it was the first model to go beyond 50% on the HLE benchmark, which is kind of a general and difficult benchmark that is meant to look at complex reasoning across domains and general knowledge. Surprising that K2 had such a low score there when it had such a high score on other benchmarks. This again maybe calls into question what is the relevance of one particular benchmark versus another, and maybe the importance of having diversity in the benchmark. We can't just look at a single benchmark. If we just looked at HLE, we'd say Grok 4 is the best thing ever and K2 is not even on the map. But when we get a fuller picture by looking at other benchmarks, we see that K2 is very competitive, and in certain benchmarks it's even better than Grok and better than Opus 4. K2 is an enormous model. It's a 1 trillion parameter model. It is by far now the best open model. The other aspect of K2 that is of high relevance and impact is the price. It is extremely cost effective. It is about 20 times cheaper than Grok 4. It is much cheaper than the Anthropic models. It's cheaper than the OpenAI models, and it is frontier level capabilities. So this is actually changing the economics. It's what happened when DeepSeek came out And all of a sudden, OpenAI realized they had competition, especially with the business model. If high-end performant models are not solely in the confines of these giant commercial labs, then they have to compete in other ways. At the application layer, as you can see happening more and more, with integrated services and through other means than just saying, we have a good model and therefore you have to pay us $300 a month if you want to have something that's powerful, when you can go somewhere else and get extremely cheap inference, or increasingly you can run it on your own hardware and have all the benefits of performance and privacy by having something running locally. We're starting to get there as far as the power and the efficiency of models, depending on the kind of hardware that you have access to, but we're nowhere near where we're going to be in the future as these efficiencies continue to scale. So Kimi K2 coming out at right around the same time as Grok. That was the basis of my article, where you can see more specific details on the benchmarks, on the community reception, on some of the experiments that I did. One of the experiments was exactly doing the research and the report comparing Grok 4 and K2. And as I mentioned, the output of Grok 4 was rather terse, just heavy on the bullet points, whereas Kimi in the researcher mode, as one of the possible outputs, created an interactive, although it wasn't fully interactive, but you could call it dynamic and visually engaging report, where you could easily scan and look with colors, with icons, with highlights and tables and callouts. Very good for information density and clarity and being able to scan and get to the essence of a very full and complex report. So I think that's going to be a process and a tool I'm going to be making a lot more use of. I'm going to see how I can incorporate that into the articles given the formatting limitations on Substack. But overall, it's kind of like combining deep research with Gamma, with some kind of visually engaging format. So very excited about Kimi, especially the fact that it's free on their website, and the fact that you can go through many inference providers, not just moonshots, creators of Kimi API. People are concerned about sending data to China. There are US inference providers you can access through OpenRouter or directly Grok, which has their language processing units, specialized hardware that are better than GPUs, is providing inference for K2 at 200 tokens per second. That's kind of the measure of the speed. It's much faster than many other models on other provider platforms. What does this mean? It means we're going to get very cost-effective and we're going to get very performant inference on Grok. You can incorporate that into agentic software development workflows, which is another thing I'm going to talk about. I'll mention briefly on today's episode, but it's an ongoing theme, one of my areas of focus, so I'll be sure to get more into that in the future. Okay, so I think that about wraps it up for Grok 4 and Kimi K2. Just the first topic of discussion. There's a couple other models that I could mention in passing. One is Mixtral's Voxtrol, which is an open source voice model. We don't see too many of those coming out. I haven't had a chance to do much hands-on exploration with it just yet, but I'm going to be looking into it because it's a very promising model, and the fact that it's an open source model is very important. I'd say voice is one of the more underexplored areas with these models, these language models, and it's going to be increasingly important as we look at other interfaces. The UI UX of AI is currently under construction. It's being experimented with, it's being thought about. We're moving beyond the chatbot and beyond the IDE, but we've yet to find the killer UI and the killer UX. Increasingly, voice is an important interface. We're seeing voice as an input for software development tools, like Windsurf just came out with voice input on Wave 11. We're looking at mobile-based triggers for agentic workflows or for software development agents. And we're looking at automation of multimedia content and cloning voices and cloning persona videos. You'll see lots of AI-generated videos of people that have cloned their face and their voice. Not a clone, I'm the real me. But it's a way to do massive content creation. And so these voice models are important for business use cases like call centers or being able to do customer service, and they're also important for finding ways to communicate where you have text reasoning or translation. I've been working on some translation tools, and the main workflow they do is they take a audio track, they transcribe the audio to text, they translate the text to another language, and then they have a text-to-speech model in the other language. That's kind of a very basic model. Also, when you're talking to an LLM, generally that's kind of the flow that they go to. There's now some direct audio-to-audio models that don't go through the transcription and text-to-speech layer, but it's an area of active development, and I'm excited to see what Mixtral has released. They're cracking out more and more interesting stuff. Another model to mention is a model that didn't get released, which is OpenAI's open weight model. They had previously announced that they were going to release it Thursday of a week ago. Then it was delayed. There was some speculation that it was because of K2 that they didn't want to release anything that wasn't state of the art, and they were working to improve it or something, but that was really just conjecture. Some people have affirmed that based on their insider knowledge, there was another issue that caused the delay, which was related to alignment, like the Mecha Hitler incident that Grok experienced before the Grok 4 release. So alignment is important, especially for a lab that cares about guardrails and cares about alignment, which it seems that OpenAI does care about. They do release model cards and they do study, kind of like Anthropic has been, what are the operating characteristics, what are the risks, and how can we mitigate them. So that seems to be the cause of this delay. We'll see. We'll see when they release it. The community is very excited for this model to come out because it seems like it's not going to be crippleware, something like GPT 3.5 or something. It's going to be a powerful model, and it's going to help with adoption, and it's going to help with access. I'm excited for that to come out and see what they've got up their sleeve. I'm going to switch over to talk about automation and research agents, or what they call generalist agents. I'm going to briefly first talk about what that even is and how interesting it is that we have to think about that. You probably have heard of Manus, maybe you've heard of GenSpark. These are agents, some people call them generalist agents, that can basically do anything, like they're jack of all trades. They can do agentic workflows, call APIs, do deep research. They can also make use of tools. Especially interesting is browser use and computer use. We haven't seen too much of this. There is an interesting tool that came out by the makers of browser use called Mac Use. I'm going to start playing with it for operating your computer. Generally, I'd say about 90%, if not more, of what you do on your computer is now on the browser. So having browser use automation gets you most of the way to automating anything that you might want to do. But there are some instances where operating other things on either your actual computer or a virtual computer could help you do more. Mostly, they've been focused on browser use. As I mentioned, it gets you most of the way there, which means that these agents launch a browser and can manipulate it, which gets you beyond web search and scraping, where you run into limitations with dynamic content on websites, where you have to select filters and drop downs and put in your input fields and click on search buttons. Basically, these things are necessary for things like travel planning or purchasing things, going beyond information retrieval and actually taking action. On the one hand, some information retrieval requires filter, manipulation, and interaction. And on the other, then going beyond information gathering to things like making a dinner reservation or something. That could involve making a phone call. These are the kinds of things that these generalist agents are opening the door to do. Manus was the first one that came out. They leaned on the shoulders of giants, and they've acknowledged that they made use of the browser use package. This is a library that came out before ChatGPT's Operator did. And Operator came out, again, with much fanfare, and interestingly enough, a free and open source package performed better than Operator. operator in many ways, and it was released beforehand, even though people just didn't hear about it. It's interesting how important the distribution channels are and the brand recognition are for capturing mindshare. But so Manus pioneered the space, and since then there have been many others. GenSpark is a very powerful and popular one as well, but there are other ones like Flowwidth. I'm not even going to start naming them. There's actually, I think, about a dozen of them. And there's several open source alternatives like OpenManus, Lemon, etc. So what happened in that space is Perplexity launched a Comet browser that has this kind of agentic automation into it. And ChatGPT launched agent mode, which basically combines deep research with operator. It has been received with kind of mixed reviews. Some people are saying it's great what it can do. Other people are saying, oh, welcome to the game, is kind of like what Manus said. They've been doing this for how many months, and OpenAI finally started doing it. Other people are saying it's really slow. I've had a chance to play with it, and I think it's decent. It's interesting. It's definitely behind these other agents that have been doing it for longer. But it's a start, and it shows that OpenAI is now, as I mentioned, competing at the application layer because the model isn't enough. You have to provide more value. One thing that has been mentioned about the ChatGPT agent is that it's using a new model that has not been highlighted. They're getting better benchmark results on certain challenges, on certain tasks using this ChatGPT agent. Curious to see how that continues to unfold. See if this agent is made available through an API, which is going to be a big differentiator. We'll see what kind of impact this has. It was something that had a lot of fanfare. We've seen that a lot of these OpenAI releases, like Codex, are released and people think it's just going to change the world, and then the hype just kind of dies down because they don't end up delivering as well as other alternatives, maybe some open source alternatives, maybe from some other vendors, or maybe they just have some bugs or some performance issues, and the promise of the value that they can deliver is met with real life challenges. Something to be aware of, but also something to keep some skepticism around to understand the limitations of the promises that they hype. Why I mentioned that it's interesting to even talk about what these things are, these generalist agents, is because I also feel that there is a line being blurred between software development and automation, which don't initially seem to be that closely related. Something that can manipulate your browser and do research versus something that builds software. But I'm going to explain why I think so. Agentic IDEs like Cursor and Windsurf have been increasing their agentic capability by making use of more and more tools, especially through the use of MCP servers. MCP has standardized tool use for agents. There's now hundreds of MCP servers that agents can make use of to pull data from data sources or to take actions. This allows these agentic IDEs to perform web searches, look at documentation. Even I saw some very clever uses of connecting to browsers and taking screenshots in order to have these agents be able to see what they're actually building and then iterate in a more automated fashion than an engineer doing it manually and feeding it into the LLM. So this tool use is an agentic aspect. Managing the context is an agentic aspect, how the memory is managed. I've seen that people are using Manus to write code. Now we're seeing increasingly agentic software development workflows. What I mean by that is not starting in the IDE. And this has been my preferred method of building. I don't start in the IDE. I start with the specs. So I start with a powerful reasoning model to generate a product requirements document that then has all the specifications for the functionality, what this thing is supposed to do. Then you create a design or architecture document that specifies how you want this to be done. What are the technology stacks? What are the libraries? What are the scaling and security and design considerations? And then from that, having an implementation plan, a checklist, maybe some stages and some line items of what are all the steps that I want my agents to proceed through. This is planning out a whole project, and it's very different than being in a chat interface saying, build me this, do that, interactively. You're laying down the groundwork of the whole thing that you want to accomplish. You're structuring all the information and all the knowledge for how this should be done, and then getting into the details of the individual to-do lists. Then you pass all of that to an agentic system. So these IDEs are increasingly agentic. They're able to do more and more automation, and then you sometimes have to tell it to continue, or they can continue on their own. But there are other tools that are starting to be better at this agentic automation. Claude Code popularized agentic software development and getting out of IDE. OpenHands has been the most promising tool that I've come across when I wrote an article on the autonomous developer, which was a play on words for autonomy of the developers as well as an autonomous agent doing the development. I saw out of all the tools that I examined that OpenHands had a lot of versatility. They had a CLI, they had a headless mode for automation, they had a self-hosted service, a locally hosted service with or without Docker. They had a cloud SaaS, and they had integration into GitHub issues, GitHub pull requests, and mentions from Slack. So you're starting to see kind of this fanning out of hooks into agentic software development systems. Cursor also recently launched voice mode in a web app that people can interface through their phones. I've been seeing that people are having Claude Code hooks through apps on the phone or ways of tunneling into your machine from the phone in order to go beyond having to be hands-on keyboard to do development. We're seeing the interface for development expand, and we're seeing that a lot of this has to do with intelligent automation, which is full circle what I was talking about with the ChatGPT agent mode or Manus or GenSpark. I'm building one as well called Nexus Agents, starting with the deep research part, but with an eye toward the automation part. These automation systems are going to start to blend into the development systems because they involve tool use, they involve autonomous execution of self-produced plan or a predetermined and provided plan. They involve different outputs and connecting to persistent artifacts. We'll see if they continue to be differentiated, they continue to blend. We'll see the major providers start to compete in that space. The OpenAI planned acquisition of Windsurf was a real eye-opener, seeing that this model developer and AI provider was now looking at software development, seeing how these things are blending together. And then the fact that they rolled out Codex and deep research and operator, all of these are different arms of OpenAI's operations, but they're going to be integrated. They're going to be combined. All of this is going to work together. They have some underlying common principles. It's interesting to see how these various tools are maybe going to be less fragmented, and we're going to see interoperable systems either from different providers or walled gardens from a certain provider. So Windsurf, very interesting drama that has been going on with them. I've been an avid fan of Windsurf since they launched in November of last year. I've used Cursor as well, but Windsurf seems to have a better magic feel for the user's intention, pairing with the user. This is one of my favorite areas of interest, is human AI collaboration. Seeing how we can find the balance between agentic automation and having a human in the loop, leveraging human creativity. We're not replacing humans, we're augmenting them, we're amplifying them. And how we can balance that automation part with the oversight and the transparency, leveraging the user's knowledge, being able to make the best of both. That's an interesting area, and one that I feel like Windsurf has done really well, predicting, anticipating your intention and your needs and getting into a rhythm, what they call the flow. You do something and they see it's repeated operation, they help you do it again the next time, or they can anticipate the changes that you want to make in a file based on the first change. Windsurf has since gained a lot of traction, up to the point where OpenAI was going to purchase them for $3 billion. That put them on the map As I understand, one of the main reasons why that deal fell apart had to do with Microsoft and with OpenAI having access to the Windsurf IP, and then Microsoft having access to the OpenAI IP, and then directly having access to Windsurf. As far as I understand, that's one of the main reasons why that deal fell apart. They reached the expiration date of the deal, so I think they had some deadline. As soon as that deadline expired, Google swept in and did one of these acqui-hire operations that you may have heard about. Meta did a bunch of these. You may have been hearing about Meta's poaching spree. They've been hiring people from OpenAI, but they've also been hiring CEOs of startups to essentially acquire the brains behind these startups and the talent and maybe some of the IP without actually purchasing the entity. This gets around a lot of regulatory scrutiny. It cuts through a lot of red tape. It's become an increasingly popular mechanism for, I could call it, power consolidation. It's not fair to a lot of the people that built these companies. Startup life is hard. You have to sacrifice a lot, put in blood, sweat, and tears and very long hours, not for very high salaries, but for the promise of a payoff when there is a liquidity event, like an IPO or an acquisition. When these acqui-hire deals come through, as happened with Windsurf, everybody gets left behind. They hired some founders and some key people, and then left hundreds of other people with unvested equity, with no liquidity, no capital investments, with leadership vacuum. It was really sad. People are definitely looking at that as kind of not a very good move as far as the people that built that company. Then Cognition, the makers of Devin. If you're not familiar with them, Devin was the first automated engineer that came out at a hefty price point of $500 a month. Cognition, I mentioned them in one of my other articles on the multi-agent moment, where I talk about architecture, single agent versus multi-agent, the challenges of multi-agent. Cognition had a very contrarian view. They're saying don't build multi-agents, and they explained why managing context is difficult. That has been answered with a lot of other people explaining different architecture patterns, including me. I put out an article in February about multi-agent deep research architecture, which I'm now implementing in the Nexus agent system that I mentioned. But Cognition had some good points and things that need to be addressed. So they're a very interesting and capable and powerful company. They came in and they took care of all the employees. They hired them all. They vested their equity. They retained the talent, the product, the customers, the IP. So what's really interesting about Cognition's acquisition of Windsurf is what this means for the future of software development, at least as far as Windsurf is concerned. Devin is an autonomous agent, and Windsurf is an agentic IDE. How these things can be combined into a cohesive product offering is alluring. They already hinted at some of this in the acquisition announcement, that you could have multiple Devins, these agents operating in the background, and then the human in the loop component of using the IDE to supervise the actions and plan and be able to monitor and again navigate that dynamic tension between autonomy and traceability and transparency and accountability with human oversight and intervention. This leads us to the other exciting announcement in the area of agentic software development this week, which was Amazon's Kiro. Some people say Cairo. I don't know. I haven't heard it announced officially. I've only read it. Kiro. First, it can be met with skepticism of yet another VS Code fork. We've seen a few of these VS Code forks become multi-billion-dollar unicorns, and we'll have to see where this new offering is going to land. But what is interesting about it is how it structures the software development workflow, which is pretty much exactly how I structure the workflow that I mentioned of creating the spec and having spec-driven development. They actually integrate and automate this precisely to go through the 3 phases of first the requirements, gathering the requirements, specifying them, having the human involved in the final review of those requirements as they're understood and polished, and then the design, the architecture, all the decisions of how this thing is then going to be brought into form, and then having the human be brought in again to review the design and make adjustments as necessary. And then finally, the implementation plan, the to-do list of what are all the things that are going to be executed in order with the dependencies and the kind of the decomposition of tasks, which has parallels to the multi-agent research that I mentioned. And again, why these lines get blurred between research and automation and software development. So Kira has a very well-structured approach to this. Similar to the CLI engineer tool that I mentioned, is meant to be a fully automated system driven from a spec, and I've had fairly good results with it so far. We're going to see how Kiro ends up being adopted and the impact and the reception that it gets. But so far, it is, if nothing else, a good herald for what the future of software development is like. Less focus on being inside of an IDE, doing tab completion, and more focus on creating complete specifications and architecture and implementation plans in order to provide that as input to a more fully automated agent. So that was a lot. I'll quickly mention a couple of other things that are interesting this week in the multimodal AI space. VO3, which has been out for a while, they had image to video, but they didn't have image to video with speech. And speech is the defining characteristic of VO3. This is why it's become such a viral model, creating new frontiers in what is possible by having videos where people talk. What does that mean? The implications are a little bit more important than you may realize, because not only can you start with an image instead of just a text prompt to generate speech, but that enables chaining. There's another tool that I've been working on called TTV Pipeline, which has automated workflows for long form video generation with these models that only create 5 or 8 or 10-second clips, which is not enough to really provide engaging content. These clips can be manually stitched together, but for more cohesion, to have the same character or in the same setting, the way that you do that is you take the last frame of a clip and you use that as the starting frame of the next clip. There's 2 ways to do that. One I call keyframe mode, which is first you generate the keyframes, the images for the transitions between those clips, and then you use that as the starting point. Or you use a chaining mode where you generate a clip and then you extract the last frame and you use that as the first frame for the following clip. The tool that I mentioned I'm very excited about is able to fully automate that process. You pass it a prompt, it splits up the prompt into the prompts for the individual segments, and it extracts the frame or generates the keyframes. So I'm very excited that we now have image to video with speech for VO3. That means it's going to be really easy using the tool that I mentioned to generate multi-minute long videos with speech. I'm going to explore some use cases of that and publish it over the next week or 2, but we're going to see a lot of interesting developments there. Speaking of long video, another one is LTX Video. They've been doing some interesting things. They released what they call real-time direction of long-form AI-generated videos with continuous narratives. That means that as you're generating the video, you're able to adjust and give feedback and have this continuity. So very interesting. And also, the other thing that they did is they're creating up to 60-second videos. Having long-form videos is very challenging for the majority of the video generation models. I mentioned some of this in a previous article that I wrote as well. There's technical reasons behind that, and there's some interesting innovations that are trying to get around that. Those are our 2 main noteworthy events in multimodal AI this last week. Briefly, other industry use cases in medicine. Google released MedGemma as an open open source models for healthcare, supporting diagnosis, imaging, and patient care. And OpenMed on Hugging Face has over 380 state-of-the-art named entity recognition models designed for healthcare AI applications. Very interesting to see what's happening in the open source space for medicine. Finally, industry business. CoreWeave has announced a $6 billion investment in a new data center. CoreWeave is one of the main specialized AI inference providers in the US. And the fact that there's still this massive investment in data centers means that despite gains in efficiency, we're still betting big on infrastructure. We're gonna need to do so in order to have capacity for increasing demands. Very interesting to see them coming more and more into the mainstream. We'll see what happens when that capacity is fully brought online. So that's it for today. I started off by saying this is going to be a shorter episode. It's actually turned out into a longer episode than anticipated because I ended up combining kind of my analysis of my article as well as industry events. I'll talk about academic papers in a separate video so that I can go into more detail of some 3 interesting papers that came out in this last week. And excited to regularly keep you up to date on ongoing developments in industry and technology and academics. So until next time.